Okay, this is a joint meeting of the Affordable Housing Committee and Town Planning and Zoning Commission on March 14th, 2022. In just a few minutes, we'll have introductions from the respective chairs of the commission. And then we'll have a brief presentation from Glenn Schalter of Planometrics and an open discussion. So bear with me. Here we go. Okay. I think we are live. One second. Oh, wait a second. I'm on the wrong thing.
There you go.
Okay.
Okay, so we have Gwynn Alperovich from the Affordable Housing Committee is joining us online. So that's Steve, would you like to make an introductory remarks?
Yeah, so it's just Gwynn on.
Yes. So far.
Okay. Good evening, Steve Grothwell, Chair of the Affordable Housing Committee. With me is Nina and Janice and Gwynn, and we're missing a couple of others who couldn't be here tonight. So we're doing the Affordable Housing Plan update as is required by the state. It's due June 1st, and we have done an awful lot of work to date. We're meeting tonight with TP&Z for several reasons. First is to get your comments on the plan. Hopefully you've had an opportunity to look through it. And in addition, by the way, there's a one-page handout that I did that highlights the strategies. And in yellow, you'll see the 4 or 5 where TP&Z we're hoping would be directly involved. As I said, we've done an awful lot of work working with Glenn Schalter from Planometrics. And because of a number of our strategies involve TP&Z, then we need your comments and hopefully your agreement to move forward on some of the strategies. And just in general, feedback on anything that's in the plan would be appreciated. That's it.
Hi, good evening. I'm Tommy Noonan, Chair of the Fairfield Town Plan and Zoning Committee. We look forward to working with you this evening and even in the future. We know you guys have put in a lot of hard work. I have commissioners with me. I'll let them introduce themselves, or do you want me to introduce?
I think that would be good. You just go.
Yeah.
I'm Jim West, Planning Director for the Town of Fairfield.
Kathy Braun, Zoning Commissioner.
Emmeline Harrigan, Assistant Planning Director. Greta Gordon, Commissioner Alternate.
Stephen Levy, Commissioner.
Lenny Coleman, Vice Chair.
Commissioner. Alexis Erickson, Commissioner.
Thank you again for the invitation. We look forward to working with you.
Why don't you go keep.
Janice School Basis, Affordable Housing.
Nina Valdez.
Steve Grothwell.
I'm Glenn Schalter from Planometrics.
In the back if you want to. Hey, Anna.
Hi. Anna with the patch, not a public official. Here to listen and watch.
Steve, like to say hello. Mark Barnhart, Director of Community Economic Development. So with that, I'll just turn things over to Glenn. And I believe we have.
Good to go, Mark?
I think so.
Well, good evening. It's a pleasure to be here. As Steve indicated, had a pleasure of working with the Affordable Housing Committee on the preparation of this plan. What's significant about this plan is Fairfield has created 2 affordable housing plans before. Those were because the town recognized the need for affordable housing at different times as the circumstances were changing. This is the first plan required by state law. And so it's been a pleasure and an opportunity to work with the committee on this. The slides are going to look familiar because they basically sort of build on what Steve talked about. But I'm happy to go through them and just kind of set the stage for questions and things that you may have. And I guess if the clicker is not going to work. You hit down, just the down button. Does it work? Oh, there we go. Oh, thank you very much. I'm sorry.
You pushed it. You pushed the button.
When you see me go like this, that's what I'm doing. So the operative statute that we're working under is Connecticut General Statute 8-30J. The 8-30 part may sound familiar to you because of 8-30G. But this section is a requirement for the town to prepare an affordable housing plan, as was indicated by June 1 of this year. So it's amazing how fast time flies when you're having fun. And we find ourselves not too far away from that time. The statutory requirement is for the plan to specify how the municipality intends to increase the number of affordable housing developments in the municipality. It's not the most artfully worded because it's developments, not units. But this is what we're working with. And we've interpreted that to mean units because that's really the issue that relates to people and housing. And as was indicated in the statute, the plan needs to be updated every 5 years. So you're familiar with the POCD, that's every 10 years. So this is, I think, an indication of the priority the state felt for this in terms of making this a recurring scenario each time. Oh, it worked. Yeah, thank you. Whatever you woke it up. Perfect. As I indicated earlier, Fairfield has a history of preparing affordable housing plans. The 1988 plan was really one of the first in the state that dealt with this issue in the way that Fairfield did. In some of my work, I've seen a chart, prepared a chart, which compares average incomes to average housing prices. And it's really in the mid to late 80s that we really start to see this divergence where housing prices relative to income get to an inflection point and start to take off. And Fairfield recognized this and tackled the issue head on. So here we are tonight. I believe this is the Jackie Durrell. Correct? Jackie was first selectman at the time and actually drove this effort. So I just think it's sort of exciting, if you will, that we're kind of completing a circle, this type of effort. The 2014 plan was a recognition that after the housing crisis in the 2006, 2008 range and some of the issues that came along, quite a bit had changed since 1988. This was an opportunity to update the plan and reacquaint Fairfield residents with the circumstances in the community today. And so we've been building on this effort as part of this plan here overall. We started last summer in terms of working on the plan and different background booklets and discussions, et cetera. We discussed and refined a wide variety of different ideas in terms of ways that we could influence the preparation of the plan and the creation of affordable housing units. We did a community survey online and we had over 1,100 participants in the survey, that gave us great information for our efforts. And as you recall, we met with TPZ back in October and shared some ideas in terms of where we were going. And that feedback was very helpful for us now in terms of putting this plan together. So the plan can exist really sort of in 2 parts. Tonight, we're going to talk about the executive summary that hits the highlights, but there's additional information in the full report. The overall goals of the committee is to accumulate enough housing unit equivalency points over the next 5 years to qualify for at least 1 4-year moratorium under 830G. So the town is better able to plan where and what types of housing are developed. You get a 4-year moratorium by creating enough housing unit equivalent points to equal 2% of the housing stock. So that's a considerable number of units, but also, as you're aware, Fairfield's been making progress in this area. And there's units in the pipeline. So we are close to our first moratorium and hopefully additional points and moratoriums after that. The second goal is to provide a broad range of housing options and choices. What we talked about was that the age demographics of the community are changing, people's housing preferences are changing, and that there could be opportunities to meet these housing needs without capital A affordable housing, but other housing options and choices. We ended up with tier 1 strategies. We talked through quite a number of strategies, but these were the ones that we felt could have the highest impact in terms of accomplishing these goals. The first one was to increase the affordability set-aside requirement. If the affordability set-aside requirement is 10%, we're basically keeping level with units that are created, and we're not making progress, particularly if those units also expire over time. So there are different zoning districts in Fairfield with different affordability percentages. And so the plan advocates for increasing that percentage. And clearly what that percentage could or should be is a topic for discussion.
Can I interject here?
Absolutely.
So the one pager that I had handed out, you'll see that it's not noted up there, but on the one pager, TP&Z is an important part of us doing that first one. And I do want to add that the affordable housing plan that we did 6 years ago or so with Glenn's help, we had 11 action items in order to reach our goals. And we did very well on meeting a number of those. And most of them was because we were working with TP&Z. We got the inclusionary zoning through your assistance. We did some work on the ADUs with your assistance. We got the inclusionary zoning fee with your assistance. And so hopefully we can hit a number of those this time around. Thanks.
How close are we to the moratorium?
We're, I would just enroll in rough numbers, around 50 points shy of 433 points needed at present. That's based on the 2010 census number. We would expect at some point the 2020 census numbers to be released publicly. The estimates so far would indicate a minor or modest impact in terms of the housing equivalency point goal that we would need. But in terms of projects in the pipeline, the two that are currently under construction will put us closer. These are at 78 Uncle Place and 528 Black Rock Turnpike. We'll probably need one more project to actually break ground.
How many units do you break that down? How many units they got for each? And I think it's a question I get asked all the time by people.
Well, it depends because units don't count the same.
Yeah.
So rental units typically start at 1.5 points based on 80%. They count 2 points if they're 2.5 points if they're lower, targeted lower income threshold. If they're ownership units, then 1.5 points, depending on which income bracket is part. So it's hard to make the direct comparison. Of course, all these are at this point just estimates. Until such time as we actually make the application, the Department of Housing may have a different ideas of what each of these developments is worth point-wise. But I think we have a pretty good sense of that at this point.
I hear what you said about the 2020 census.
Yeah.
When that comes out, will that make us farther away? Because there will be,
We'll move the goalposts a little bit.
okay,
We'll move it a lot.
maybe like 60 or 70.
It's about 7 points.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
We have, that won't really impact us in terms of crossing the finish line. We're going to need one more project, pretty good size project that's over. There are a number of candidates potentially based on rules that have already been granted. But typically, once they break ground, it's at least an 18-month construction cycle before they're in a position to get a CO, and that's when we can actually count the units.
Just jumping back for a second to the question about points. In the full report, we've added a glossary in the back. As you point out, many people aren't familiar with some of the terms that we use. And on page 33 of that report in the glossary, There's a definition for housing unit equivalent points, and then there's a table that shows what you get in terms of ownership or rental, et cetera. So as Mark indicated, the most you get per unit is 2.5. So in 50 points, that would be 20 units in that scenario. But those are rented units at 40% of AMI. Those are challenging to create. So if we go with an 830G at 80% of area median income, that could be somewhere half a point if it's elderly and 1.5 if it's, and so that would get you what the numbers could be.
Maybe helpful. I know I provide this periodically, definitely to our affordable housing committee and also to the TPMC staff, but we provide an updated development tracker where we assess the current status of the projects that are in the pipeline, so to speak, and what housing points we anticipate with each one. So I'll make sure that that gets to Jim.
Yeah, I just have one more question. I don't know if it's in the I appreciate that. I also would like to know, and I don't know who tracks this, but is there any data to show how these are these units occupied or building affordable housing, or are they actually occupied?
One thing, yeah, we do get annual compliance reports from all the projects that are placed into service. I review those and provide comments back to Jim, your planning director, in terms of whether or not they meet the standard or not. Typically.
I'll just put it on down here. I can't speak, so I'm just gonna. I'm on mute.
I'll take Herb.
Herb, would you mind muting if you're on this call?
We have a spreadsheet that we can, unless you need to
Oh,
update. Mark has prepared it. We have it. We can circulate it to you, but the two things to note in the glossary, if you're looking at page 33, is Glenn, the market rate units each count for a quarter of a point as well. So all of the market rate units in an 8-30G get a quarter of a point. The affordable units get obviously 4 points. And we have that track. The affordable housing plans that are submitted as part of those developments, they require an annual certification. They have a city unit, they have to report the household income in that unit, what the rents are to make sure, and Mark checks those to make sure they're still in the affordability range. If somebody, for example, has got to the point where over the course of the year, their income is now outside of that 80% range, then the landlord's obligated to offer the next available unit as an affordable unit. So if the affordable units move around as people come and go and as people's incomes might change, and they're obligated to offer the next available unit if someone becomes ineligible because they may have earned more income than they had the year prior.
one more follow-up. This law is what, 32 years old, give or take. Most of these 830Gs are need research by 40 years. And we'll begin to see some of these age out in the next decade. Are we tracking any of that? Like when some of these will be aging out, because we'll just have to build more dense housing at that point.
Yes, we do have a list of developments that count towards our inventory and the date in which the deed restrictions.
It's in the packet.
I don't know that's in.
I don't think it's, unless Glenn grabbed it somewhere, but I certainly can provide it.
Thank you.
I have, the state actually maintains a database, an Excel spreadsheet of all towns in the state. They track to the day the expiration of all of the units. So, yeah, it's pretty important. I think when the statute was first created, initially a restriction period was 20 years. Then it went to 30. Now it's at 40. And I think this issue of the expiration of units and them going offline is awakening people to that particular scenario, that however hard we work to create affordable units, if they continue to disappear, it becomes sort of a challenging scenario. I think strategy number 2 in the tier 1 category is to look at the design residence district, perhaps in ways that it could be reviewed and amended to increase its ability to provide housing options, number of affordable housing units, and possibly enable smaller housing developments where appropriate and increase housing options overall. So perhaps not necessarily big projects with a lot of units, but it could be locations adjacent to business zones and other places where the DRD could fit in if we in fact allowed smaller parcels to have a small, well-designed multifamily development on it. And that might have the potential to produce a number of new units sized to meet people's changing housing needs. As people age, they often seek smaller, lower maintenance, less expensive types of housing. That could address that scenario in addition to the capital A affordable housing units as well.
So I've got some prepared remarks about the DRD when we get to it, once you go through
I'll keep going. Happy to. Strategy number 3 is the only strategy, as Steve pointed out here, which doesn't involve TPZ. All of these other ones really perhaps involve some regulation changes, et cetera, where, as we indicated, teamwork would be very important. But this one is to work with another important team member in town, which is the Housing Authority, their work to create additional affordable housing units. The Housing Authority can, through state and federal funding, reach the deepest levels of affordability in terms of at 40% of area median income or 50% or 30%, et cetera. They can tune the project to the neighborhood based on what they think is a scenario which could work. And 100% of the units often are in fact affordable. So it's not 10% of the units or 20% of the units, it's possibly 100% of the units. So we can get considerable points and address some of the most challenging housing needs through partnering and working and supporting the Housing Authority in their work. Strategy number 4 and the tier 1 is to look at establishing and strengthening design guidelines and locational guidelines for multifamily housing, mixed-use development, and other housing options to support greater flexibility and opportunity. We know that TPZ is working on the town plan and also on the zoning regulations. So these could be opportunities. We prepared some maps along the way, which looked at the location of attributes which could perhaps support housing related objectives. Proximity to transit, both bus lines and train stations, where water sewer is available, where businesses might be within walking distance to create sort of a neighborhood focus. These might be locational guidelines that might influence, for example, design residence district or other approaches in terms of density, et cetera. So in the survey, it came back sort of loud and clear that the design of housing was important to people. When they hear affordable housing, very often they have thoughts which development which they feel would be inappropriate. Yet we have examples and have seen visual examples of developments which are visually appropriate. So how can we encourage that? And then also for locational guidelines overall. So those are the tier 1 strategies.
We're going to pause here just to see if there's any other questions or thoughts or observations in relation to that, and maybe let Jim talk to the DRD. Yeah.
Just real quick. Are there any, you'll probably get to this later, but are there any projects or proposals pending now from the Fairfield Housing Authority? That seems like low hanging fruit if they could get something done like that.
I know you had approved the project at 90D High Street, which was on appeal through the wetlands. They need to go back to the wetlands and resolve those issues with respect to that. They've also looked at a property on Hero Street, East Highway, St. Edwards Parish, that it was the site of a former alternative high school. So they looked at possibly acquiring that property. Working with the church, and I understand there might be another potential buyer for that site.
Okay.
So again, part of the challenge is always finding suitable locations and then having the wherewithal to quickly put it under contract, so you have the ability then to work through the development questions. But that's oftentimes the challenge, because there's a lot of other people out there trying to do the same thing. Jim, would this be a good time to maybe talk about that?
I think it's a tier one type strategy here, so I think advancing that conversation.
Yeah. On page 17 of the plan, it talks about some menu of options for design residence district, but for those of you that may not be familiar with what the design residence district was, I want to give you a short overview on that because it's been some time. So the design residence district has been in the regulations since the 50s. And historically, that's the district, it's an overlay district, and it's essentially where all the condos had been built. And I list 4 examples on the bottom. So there are many. We have a couple thousand units. I list 4 examples. Westwood, which is adjacent to the train station, which you're familiar with, 136 units. Stilson Oaks, Stilson Road, right behind the Lake Hill Shopping Center. Pine Ridge, which is on South Pine Creek, kind of across the street from the Par 3 golf course. And Dogwood Green is another example on the corner of Fairfield Woods in Stratford Road. There are many, many others. But in the top part above the first line, the regulations for 30 or more years had regardless of what zone was being applied for, there was a universal density. It was 9,375 square feet, which is the A zone minimum lot size for the first unit, and then 3,000 square feet per unit thereafter, which, depending on your lot area, would yield between 12 and 14.5 units per acre. So at a 1 acre site, it would be 12 units. You get up to 30 acres, those numbers bump up to like 14.5 units. In the late 80s, mid to late 80s, there was a popular option. There were a lot of condominium developments proposed at the time that the commission was looking at, and there was a sentiment in the community. Okay, we've got enough condos. We're building condos. We need to throttle it back. The marketplace was kind of saturated. In 1988, the commission amended the design residence district to how it's presently in our regulations, and that's in between those 2 lines. The present regs, but 1988, what it did was tie the density that you could have in a condominium to the underlying zone. It created much larger minimum lot sizes. For example, in the AAA zone, you needed a 30-acre minimum, and you could only have a half a unit per acre, which is really the same, not very much more density than you could do in a regular subdivision. 10-acre minimum in the AA zone, only 1 unit per acre yield. Our half-acre zone, you needed a 5-acre minimum and 3.2 units per acre yield. And on down to our A zone, 1 acre minimum, 6.9 units per acre, which is more or less what the A zone regulations permit. And since then, we haven't had too much DRD density. And what we are suggesting and what we've discussed with Glenn and the committee as potential options to consider is, as we are faced with applications for particularly 8-30G applications that are looking for much greater densities, we think it's time to have the conversation as to whether or not the timing might be right to consider increasing the densities that we permit under the DRD to give a developer an option to do more than they could do today under the present regs, but a less dense project than would result if someone were to do a full-blown 8-30G application. So it's an opportunity to have a conversation about increasing those densities to give someone an opportunity to do something in between. On page 17, and we'll get to it later, there's some options to consider whether the timing might be right to allow a greater opportunity, to allow a smaller project at a greater density than you can do now, to give a developer an opportunity for something less onerous than a full-blown 8-30G. That's kind of the background of those questions. Yes.
Anecdotally, have you been approached by applicants or attorneys that are curious about that idea?
Well, we have had a property that has been in play for a while, that where people have asked, what can they do? And they're looking at, in everything that our regulations would permit now versus doing an 8-30G application. Well, I can't do what I want to do unless I do 8-30G. So there might be an opportunity if we could get that unit count up into the 12 to 15 unit per acre range potentially. That, you know, again, on a smaller lot, that's a smaller project. So yes, not a huge number, but I think if we give opportunity points, potential investors or developers to an opportunity that's greater than they can have today, but lesser than the 8-30G option, it might be, you know, something quite better, especially if we're also, you know, considering as the number one bullet there, considering a higher set aside requirement. Yes.
If we were to coincidentally increase the affordability set aside 15 or 20%, do you think that would be a problem as far as, you know, promoting these, you know, increased density but lesser of the 830G developments?
That's a good question. We'd have to, I guess, do some math. We'd have to enlist Carol to do some math maybe to see what really is 15% the right number at a certain density, or if are we getting to the point of, well, heck, if I got to set aside that many percent, I might as well just go for the greater density at 30%. So yeah, you're probably right. There's probably a sweet spot there somewhere that we would need to find. And that's something that we should explore. That's a good, excellent question.
And likely would have to revisit from time to time anyway, because market conditions change. So, but I think we would have to look at the development performance and see whether or not we can make it feasible, financially feasible, and enough of an incentive that somebody would opt for that.
If I jump in just for a second, I think the other significant thing is that an 830G requires a 60% of AMI and an 80, and the 60 is really my understanding from talking with developers is an 80% AMI unit basically covers its cost of development. The 60% is that hurts. So if the DRD was at an 80% of AMI, or even a bonus for going to 60, there's as Mark says, penciling it out becomes a situation that it might have advantages for developers.
And I could add that if it's in black and white, if it's written down and the developers know what they can do as of right, I think that adds to their ability to work with a higher set aside.
We have, it seems to me that we're, you know, we're pretty developed here. How much can we develop there? Yeah, I assume that we have to stay in structure, not down, but I would be happy.
Well, you know, every time we think, you know, when I got here, everyone described town, it's true, very mature, developed movement around 1639, right? So there's very few undeveloped parcels, but that hasn't stopped development. There's always redevelopment or new development that's occurring. Infill development of existing sites. So I think, you know, what we can't necessarily anticipate that we've exhausted all the likely candidates, because there's always seems to be something out there that we haven't really considered. There's enough market drive demand to support a lot of these 830G applications, which we're currently seeing. So yeah, just trying to provide another option, you know, but for this, I would not go 830G. Well, can we fill that in something?
And I would add that new technology makes development even possible in areas like Greenfield Hill. You can do a large development on a septic nowadays.
Okay.
It's the bulk being wet. It's really, just really. So we can do take the suggestion. Is that do some more realistic limitation. Citizens will be happy. And we think that.
And with appropriate design guidelines too, to ensure that you get something that actually blends in, fits into the neighborhood. Looks good.
the advantage of creating potentially a greater opportunity under regulations that we all create is that they have to stick to those regulations. Right now, the DRD allows us a 3-story building at 40 feet, which is the same height requirement as the R3, AA, AAA zones on up. So it's not an inconsistent height requirement than what we presently have in our regulations. And we have a 20% lot coverage cap, 50% floor area ratio cap, or whatever design element you think is appropriate. The advantage is if we can get density right and folks avail themselves of that opportunity, they have to meet the design standards. The difference, obviously, as you are well aware, the 8-30G standard, if they go that way, they don't have to apply any of those standards. So,
And it's also the length, the one we're going to, it's just so long, they just cut it into.
well, again, that's the advantage of creating a design requirement that someone would hopefully avail themselves of, and then they have to meet that standard rather than going off menu, so to speak, doing whatever they think is going to make their project economically feasible.
Ready to one?
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing on this. That I think there's 2 significant things that I just wanted to pass on. The state established a task force this past legislative session that's supposed to be coming up with housing design guidelines, kind of a guidebook, sometime, I think, in the next 6 to 9 months. There's no firm deadline for it, but that's when their report is supposed to be out. So it's quite possible that that could provide useful information that the town could then piggyback on. The other thing, Carrie's not here tonight. Carrie Makeover found a website called Affordable Housing Design Advisor on page 20 of the full report that shows their website. And it actually has some wonderful examples that can be used to guide development. And so I think Affordable Housing Committee is hoping that the planning TPZ might sort of embrace this concept and try to figure out ways with the consultant you're working with on the POCD and the zoning regs to bring this in. It could be a wonderful addition and a new opportunity overall. So there's a number of recommendations in the long version of the plan to address that. Mark it. Wake it back up. There you go. Thank you so much. So the tier 2 strategies are moderate or high impact. These are things that support the overall effort. The first recommendation here is to look at ways to perhaps increase the affordability term beyond the 40-year period. There are municipalities around the state looking at this. I think Darienne's requirement is for the life of the unit or 40 years, whichever is longer. I know that your regulations have also addressed this particular issue, but it seems to be an area of growing interest around the state because, again, 40 years goes by quickly. And if the units disappear, we're going to be continually doing this. The recommendation is to go ahead and look at that particular situation. The other recommendation is to look at ways to deed restrict existing housing units. There are not a lot of units in Fairfield which are naturally affordable, given where sort of interest rates and everything's naturally affordable, meaning that they sell or rent at affordable prices. They're just not deed restricted. If we could figure out ways to deed restrict those units, either through tax incentives or other types of financial incentives, that we don't have to build new units. They have additional units which contribute to our affordable housing stock. We have wonderful organizations in town that assist these sorts of efforts. We've got the Housing Authority, Operation Hope, and others that could help in this particular effort. So is this a way that we could try to accomplish more?
We do have a program. I think many of you already know that we have a neighborhood revitalization program that does provide funding assistance to both nonprofit as well as for-profit landlords in exchange for deed restriction to 51% of the units within that structure rent at affordable rent. So we do get a deed restriction in exchange for that assistance. Typically, a 40-year term in order to get the housing unit equivalency points under 830G for a moratorium is a pretty big impediment. Because people don't want to necessarily, unless I'm providing a lot of financing for a project, you're providing $20,000 to replace a roof. You ask them, well, in exchange for that, restrict your unit for 40 years. They look at me like I'm crazy. So that's the drawback. So we do get the benefit from creating the affordable rental unit, but it's typically restricted for less than 40 years in order to do that. So it counts towards our inventory, but doesn't count necessarily for housing unit points moratorium.
And then the third strategy is identifying ways to allow more types of housing in more areas. Conversation these days is around this concept of what's called middle housing. Middle housing basically means housing between single-family homes at one end of the housing spectrum, and then higher density, taller buildings at the other end of the spectrum, larger multifamily projects. Yet over time, the country has been built around 2-family, 3-family houses, what they're calling cottage courts or other types of different housing flavors that are smaller, that nestle into neighborhoods. But again, in some of what we've seen on some of the other developments is either we get single family or we're getting these bigger projects that we don't really feel fit in. Could there be things in the middle, even with the DRD regulations or other things like that, that could work? They can provide for affordable units, but they can also provide other types of housing options for people and for families. And this might be a way to address housing needs as well. So,
First one, the term, are you expecting that to be prospective or retrospective?
the retrospect, I mean, the deep.
As well, I think I heard in New York, they made it retrospective, they made it lifetime, but I was just curious. I think it was New York City or New York State, I thought they did.
One of the options would simply be perhaps to build in an option at the end of the 40-year term whereby the town would exercise an option to extend it. Might have to compensate the developer, provide some mechanism by which you can do that, but at least you're providing an opportunity to restrict it for longer than a 40-year term. So that's just the thought behind it.
There are other communities in Fairfield County that are experimenting with that already, considering that to your knowledge, obviously we compete with other economic development.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, you mentioned Darien.
Yeah.
I'm not aware of too many in Connecticut. It's possibly outside of the state, which is typical. We'll look at other jurisdictions to see what they might be able to do. But I don't know if any of you had.
Yeah, so Darien does have a section of their regulations, I think it's called below market rate housing. And that section of the regulations does provide for the life of the unit or 40 years, whichever is longer. So they have essentially predicated it on more than 40 years. I am working with several communities around the state preparing these affordable housing plans, and I would say everybody's looking at this issue and trying to figure out what the next step is, because for many years, communities tended to ignore 830G and hoped it wouldn't sort of show up. And I think we're starting to realize now that affordable housing is an important issue in a community. So how do we make these units last longer to really get the benefit from them? And so this is sort of the next step. I had a developer explain it to me. He says, if I'm going to sell the unit, I don't care how long the deed restriction is, because my interest is gone. Right? So it doesn't affect them. And on the rental stream, the discounted value of an investment 40 years in the future, depending on what your discount rate is, it's not pennies on the dollar, but it's certainly much less. So the other concept that we actually talked about in the committee was a concept too, that said the initial deed restriction is for 40 years. There's an automatic renewal at the end of 40 years, except that developer or owner can offer to buy it out, and the town can accept or reject and say, no, we're going to keep that in place. Or maybe the unit's getting a little long in the tooth, and maybe we can take the money into the housing trust fund and do something bigger or better with it or something. So to provide flexibility rather than just this is what it has to be regardless of circumstances, but provide an approach that establishes an expectation for a deed restriction over the long term, but be flexible that there may be circumstances that would dictate that maybe there's a better option for us, the town.
We have just expand on that, there are two places presently in our regulations where we demand the below market rate units be for the life of the structure, but for no case no less than 40 years. It's in the two sections are 13.14.7 and 21.16.13, which are the TOD sections around Metro Center. They are our Commerce Drive transit design district and the transit-oriented development part, which is the Metro Center. So we have two sections of our regulations presently that require that 40 years of living lifetime. It's just that 8-30G doesn't tie to that at this stage. It's a minimum of 30. The question is it under an 8-30G, can we compel them for more than 40 years?
Conversation with some municipalities, and I think one of the things we talked about, and it may actually be a segue to the next page, is the concept of standard documents. And if the town was to have a standard housing affordability plan that says this is the language that you are required to use, and it lays out what those requirements are. I did some work with the town of Ridgefield, and on the town of Ridgefield's website, they actually have a standard housing affordability plan, and they have a list of approved third-party administrators. And for any affordable housing development proposed by whoever, you're either going to use our plan or explain to us why you're not going to use our plan, and we'll decide whether or not that's okay with us. And you have to use an approved administrator. It doesn't have to be one that we suggest, but you have to indicate it's somebody who's qualified.
Just on that point, I know Steve had a question, but we do have a model plan, but it's recommended that you follow. It's more a suggestion. So could we make it more compulsory or, tighten up those regulations a little bit? Steve, you had a question.
Yeah. You reference middle housing. Would that be something like the cluster housing model or the, co-op sort of cooperative living type program? Would that be particularly, appropriate for something like the Greenfield Hill area? And how would we go about promoting this sort of development?
I think that the way there's this wonderful book called Middle Housing, Missing Middle Housing is what it's called. It shows a number of examples of different types of developments. And I think that to me, it provides a little bit of a menu that for Fairfield to look at and to say, some of these building styles are distinctly sort of Californian in nature. And you might say, and I think the communities that they were being utilized in allowed on-street parking. So you have these sites which, we have snow here, right? So there's some neighborhoods maybe couldn't park on the street, and other ones, no, you can't. So how does this all work? But I think to look at what types of scenarios could fit in Fairfield. And I think Jim and Emmeline shared with me some pictures of some of the DRD developments that have been built over the years. And you think those are attractive developments, and we could, try to encourage smaller scale developments that fit into neighborhoods rather than kind of the more monolithic structures. So I think it's an exploration opportunity, maybe as part of the POCD.
Yeah, just to kind of give you an update, because we haven't noticed it publicly yet, because it's still working its way through the approval process. We have made an offer to a successful and exciting consulting firm, as you hope know. There was a slug of money set aside in ARPA funding for us to go hire consultants to help us, number one, finish our POCD update process that kind of got stalled with COVID. And number two, update and rewrite of our zoning regulations. So we're going to be re-engaging with you to re-update the process in the near term. And when we had our last public engagement sessions, we asked folks which topics do you think we need further public engagement on, and one of them was housing. So we anticipate as part of this work, we're all going to be involved in an additional public outreach session on housing, which can hopefully take a deeper dive into some of these topics. And as Glenn refers to our upcoming POCD effort and rewriting the regulations, referring that we are going to be engaging with you hopefully later this spring to ramp up in that process with the consultant on. We're excited. And once we have that officially approved through the Board of Selectmen, we'll provide you with that, their proposal, so we can show what our expectations are for the workload for you. It is going to entail some additional meetings and some planning sessions and some additional public outreach. We're excited to re-engage it.
I don't know if this goes back to the menu of options. Is there a way that we can serve ourselves better as a town to acquire land? I don't think like the outside property, I know there's a property up in the Mill area up for sale. Why are we serving ourselves better as a town to be in charge of our own destiny when it comes to affordability? So we can determine what it's like if you live there, whether it's seniors or families, what have you.
There's a couple things. We're not the most nimble
Yeah.
to actually acquire property. I'll just give it 244 Greenfield Street is a good example. So we
Great job with that.
use housing trust money to acquire a piece of property, working with a willing seller, but it required the review and approval of the Board of Selectmen. This body is doing under 824. The RTM, the Affordable Housing Committee, to allocate funds from the Housing Trust Fund. So all told, there were 4 different bodies that had to weigh in and required at least, and I sequenced it the most efficiently as possible. It still requires 60 days to get those approvals in place in order to move forward with that. So, if you're working against a private developer who can put cash down to purchase a piece of property, you're probably not going to be at the table. But there are other groups that we could potentially work with that might be better suited for that. They don't need to go to 4 or 5 boards to get approval. They just need to go to a board of directors and get the authorization and allocate the money. So the housing authority could fulfill that. But again, we have to have a kind of a meeting of the minds as to what kind of properties we're looking for. And it obviously has to make sense from their perspective in order to attract the necessary capital to make the project financially. So
Is it possible to do all that in advance and have it ready for when something comes up? Like have approval to buy something and then when it comes up, you're ready to go?
I'm not sure how, because these are typically site specific. I don't. There are not too many town boards that give you a blank check to say, here's we're going to give you a $2 million authorization. Go out and just purchase property. It's possible maybe the town could. Some communities set up redevelopment authorities that have the ability to purchase property and acquire it, and you're working through one board, one approval process to do that, kind of like a housing authority in that sense. But the RTM and other bodies would have to be willing to give up some of the authority to an independently authorized board, which then has some broad powers to do all that type of thing. So that hasn't been something that Fairfield has looked at in the past. I think one of the things we've looked at, the Affordable Housing Committee, is, again, the low-hanging fruit, look at the town's inventory of properties and determine whether or not, whether it was at one point good for a particular type of use doesn't mean 50 years later, it's still valid or good for that same use. So, again, that shouldn't be necessarily the Affordable Housing Committee acting in isolation, but there are other boards, land acquisition, conservation, other groups that might want to consider whether or not, a piece of property that the town owns is still appropriate to use it for that purpose. So we have done that, but again, the Affordable Housing Committee has asked me to go back and provide an inventory of town property. And we're going to take another look at it because it probably should be done periodically just to see, things change. So that makes sense to me. So that's one thing we could do.
I think also to answer your question in terms of the Mill Hill property at Exide, Mill Hill, for example, was listed for $3 million.
So that's not even something that we have available to us in the Housing Trust Fund. That would be a much bigger conversation townwide in terms of, are we willing to spend $3 million? Yeah.
In all fairness, the town was afforded the opportunity to purchase that property. But again, at the time, the question is posed, well, what will we do with it? Are we purchasing it for open space? Are we purchasing it for active recreation? Are we purchasing it for housing? Obviously, we need to answer that. We would expect me to provide that information if I came to you. That's one of the first questions I get asked. What's the end use? What's the intended use?
Well, it is on my church, so.
You would think there would be, some shared mission, right?
Discussions are always good.
But we have, have a situation that I just mentioned, again, other property that's owned by not the same type of religious denomination, but there are others. And it's not necessarily, you may not have the same objective in mind. So, Tommy, do you have a question?
I'll ask it later.
I like your idea of fund, what's called administrative fund. That's the only way we're going to get into this town, because every house in these 10 areas is 600, 700, 800,000. We never mind getting into the numbers. It's everything. It's all so dense. It's this is ready to go. You've got to get 6. We need a lot. We need several million dollars to get anything to do the attractive cluster.
Follow-up, you were mentioning Exide. What were you going to say about?
Oh, no, I was just going to say an Exide is upwards of $3 million in terms of its value. So that's all.
Do we know what's going on?
No, I was just making a point in terms of just the high cost of these parcels in terms of arguably the act. Yeah.
I'm really interested in knowing something. How many of our 21,000 proposal units, which as you said, probably about 23,000, are in AA and these?
We should be able to provide that.
I'm sorry.
Tell the rest of the AA and.
Looking for housing units breakdown by zone.
No, I think we did this count, Jim. I think we have it in, we have it, so we can email it around, but
Just so shocking to look at how Fairfield rates compared to all the other similar sized towns. That are percentage, how we get into percent.
Yeah.
But I really think it's because the AAA and the AA are.
I can be more specific as to.
And we just keep trying to cram into these other four towns. Because
Seward.
Sewers and water.
Yeah.
I think if you look at, and I did share this information with members of the Affordable Housing Committee, share it with your staff as well, commission. But if you looked at similarly sized communities, which is part of the plan, in terms of the number of housing units, and then you looked at their affordable housing inventory and the makeup of that, a good percentage of most of those, all the Fairfield, are either in government assisted or they're in chaplain-backed mortgages or tenant-based rental assistance, 2 categories which the town has very little to no control over. So if you look at the communities that are equal size, similarly sized in Fairfield, and look at the percentage deed restricted units as a percentage of the makeup of their affordable housing inventory, Fairfield outstrips everything by far as a percentage. So again, that's the thing that the town has direct control over by our own actions. We have entered into deed restrictions with particular property owners and property developments, restrict those units. And it's just a harder way to do that because it obviously is a little bit more fluid than government assisted, for example. But the ones that have much greater percentages, the makeup is critical, is important.
Just a follow up on that charter, sorry, the development commission, because we do have a charter revision commission open, but I can approach them to make it easier. For us to-
I was just thinking that as we were having this conversation about redevelopment authorities, because this would be an appropriate time to talk about that. Because we are examining our charter.
Yeah, it's coming up quickly where people need to get a recommendation, so we are really committed to serious.
I mean, you don't necessarily need to go through a charter revision, it's set up like ordinance, you need to do that, but again, it's a good time to have a conversation about whether this is the appropriate thing for the town to consider.
Just to clarify, so the towns that have a higher ratio, we're talking about the 10% target ratio, they have more of the government assistance, Section 8 housing and government-backed mortgages. We have more of the deed-restricted affordable housing, but that's slower and harder to get. We'll never get to 10% on that. But that's the only thing that counts towards the moratorium. There's two separate analyses, right? The moratorium only looks at deed-restricted or government-owned affordable housing.
Right.
Although the 10% ratio looks at all the other factors. Am I accurate in that?
The government assisted and, basically it has to be a unit that's placed into service or newly created or deed restricted after July 1990 and restricted for a period of 40 years.
And that counts towards the moratorium and the 10%, but the other forms of government assistance only count towards the 10%.
You'll see like tenant-based rental assistance or shadow-backed mortgages, those numbers will fluctuate quite a bit, even in the case of Fairfield. Sometimes you'll say, well, how come our percentage went down from 2.8% or 2.6% to 2.54%? Well, largely it's driven by those things.
And I've read somewhere, I don't know where, that there is a way to promote Section 8 with landlords. I don't know how that would be done.
We work with housing.
Okay.
Actually, the project is still in its infancy right now, is we're providing assistance to a private landlord who is acquiring property, single-family homes, rehabbing it, and in exchange for the assistance, will deed restricted for rental assistance such that it would count towards both our inventory and potentially towards our moratorium points, depending on the amount of assistance we provide.
So you would incentivize the landlords?
Providing the rental assistance to persons with the housing choice voucher, the Section 8 program. And he's able to make that work. The issue is it's really hard to bring it to scale. He's doing one project at a time. And, so far we've completed one project. But, it demonstrates that it's possible. And actually, what it showed me was there's more single-family homes here in town that are rental that have folks with Section 8 vouchers in it than we get credit for. Because they weren't on our deed restricted inventory until this gentleman came and said, I'm doing this. I have, 6 or 7 properties in town. I'd like to increase my inventory. Would you be willing to assist me? And so we talked about it. But again, those 6 units, there were no deed restrictions, but yet they were providing important rental housing for folks with the housing choice voucher.
So there's 2 issues: identifying the Section 8 landlords and also expanding Section 8 landlords, and then potentially, what's the incentive though for them to, on top of providing Section 8, also deed restrict?
The way the incentive from the landlord's perspective is, let's say I need to replace a boiler, windows, that type of thing. That's going to cost more money out of pocket. We can help defray that cost in exchange for a deed restriction, and that not only maintains the quality of the housing stock, but also will get credit.
And deed restrictions always have to be 40 years? Because I know
That's another earlier conversation. I'm providing $20,000 to help the gentleman re-sign the house or replace the roof. It's a really tough ask. You have to restrict it for 40 years. I could get probably 20 years, but and how it works is a declining balance slope. At the end of 20 years, it's a nice program, and we do that to try to get people to provide rental housing that meets a need.
You can't qualify without it being 40 years though, but wasn't there some exception to that I spoke to Jim about?
Well-
It's complicated.
Yeah, the accessory apartment
Oh, that's the one.
are classified differently. They qualify under the statute, it's the 10-year deed restriction, but in order to qualify for moratorium permits, it has to be 40-year deed restriction. So there's a disconnect in the two arms of the statute.
Thank you.
Key supporting actions here are related to the other things we've talked about. Creating staff capacity. If we're going to be updating these plans every 5 years, and some of the technical conversations about how we're going to be able to manage these units and oversee them, et cetera, need the staff capacity to do that. Updating the standard documents. The town already has those, but updating them for the best provisions and possibly incorporating those regulations. Requiring an administrator approved by the town. There have been examples in other municipalities where the administrators were unqualified. And as a result, either through mismanagement or other motivations, the units got lost. And after you've gone through all this work to create an affordable unit, to lose it is tremendously unfortunate. And then lastly, developing guidelines for the Housing Trust Fund. We're very fortunate to be able to have that in town, to have it producing revenue. Is ways to invest those funds to create housing. In the future, what can or should we do with that? What guidelines should we have for that fund? So those are the key supporting actions. Our conceptual schedule going forward, just so that you know, again, we have the statutory deadline of June 1st. There is currently our public hearing is scheduled for May 11th. Thinking that that's a date that will work because of the requirement for a 35-day notice period. That moves us back to April 6th. So following our conversation, et cetera, here tonight, we're seeking the opportunity in the Affordable Housing Committee to finalize the plan around March 30th. We can always make changes up through adoption. But our hope is with your feedback, et cetera, to move forward on this schedule to meet the June 1 deadline. So that's an overview of the plan. I had great conversations so far. So our additional thoughts.
I want to piggyback on the ADU comment because it's so confusing. So we were having discussions over how we could add expanded ADU, incentivization in our town, but have an affordability requirement in order to allow that. And I don't know if that's possible, but it would be nice if we could get some credit for it. But then I'm still confused over the 40 years goes to the moratorium, but a 10-year deed restriction goes towards the 10% quota, right? I have that backwards.
No, you have it exactly right.
That's very confusing to me.
It is, and we have brought that up with our delegation as a potential, as you are, I'm sure painfully aware, there's so much spaghetti getting thrown on the refrigerator now to see if it sticks in terms of land use bills. But one of the things we have raised over the last couple of weeks, can we fix that moratorium credit for the ADU to match the denominator calculation that at 10 years, because it's going to be very, very difficult for us to achieve a 40-year deed restriction on ADU. And I think the discussion that we have had around that topic when we updated it the last ADU with Steve referenced before, the Affordable Housing Committee was a co-applicant in 2021. We had a fairly lengthy discussion about that. And it was our recommendation at the time, and I think I still have the same opinion, that if there is going to be an incentive to require that to be an affordable unit, there would have to be some sort of monetary incentive for that. That would likely be outside of the scope of the zoning regulations. We've talked with town administration over the years about potential tax abatement if they deed restrict an ADU. But until we can get that disconnect connected, it'd be 10 years on both ends to count towards moratorium points. It's less of an incentive for us to.
That's exactly where the discussion was before. We had talked previously about whether or not we can incentivize the development of ADUs by either providing a tax abated and tax credit or direct financing to allow for the creation of ADUs in exchange for a deed restriction that would then qualify for moratorium. And at the time, we thought there was this provision in the statutes that referenced a 10-year deed restriction in order to provide credit. It's my opinion still that there is a reason that that language is different in the statute versus everything else. The Department of Housing has a completely different interpretation of that, which is in order to count towards the moratorium, it needs to be restricted for a period of 4 years or more and be restricted or created after July 1, 1990. So, but it's interesting because we have restricted units that have 5-year restrictions, 15-year restrictions, 20-year restrictions under our CDBG program, which I referenced earlier, that count towards our broader inventory because we're providing $10,000 or $5,000 or $15,000. So the state will accept those towards our inventory, but they don't obviously meet the standard, the 40-year standard for moratorium. So to Jim's point, I think it got confused because at the time we were talking about whether there's a possibility for us to provide a financial inducement or incentive with the belief that if we could do that in exchange for a deed restriction for 10 years, we'd get moratorium. But the regulation amendment we put forward, we think, and I think Steve can talk, Carrie's not here, she was our primary opponent, but ADUs provide, obviously housing options for folks, particularly seniors, and at its basic level provides increased affordability with or without the restriction. So I think that was primary benefit, but again, there was this other conversation we had about can we incentivize it so that we actually get restrictions as well.
So even if you can't get, it's not going to happen that you get anyone to want to do a 40-year deed restriction for an ADU. But even if you get the 10 years, does that then qualify in the numerator but not the denominator? How does that work out? Because our ratio keeps getting worse. Okay, it gets cited in court cases on appeals. I've read footnotes and judicial decisions that our ratio is getting bad. Makes us look bad. In reality, our actual affordable housing is going up. So how can you make that ratio go up just to help us?
Well, I'll take
Can ADUs help us with that?
What we've tried, what I've said at least a few times now is we're not going to get to 10%.
Yeah.
Because nobody's got a 10% in 30 years. This has been, unless you already had the 10%,
Right.
no municipality has gotten to that.
You're starting with 20,000.
So it was a threshold that was set that would, for the municipalities to which this appeals process would apply, wasn't necessarily meant to be all municipalities in the state have to achieve 10%. We're not going to likely get to the 10%. What the number one strategy or goal of this plan, number one, is to try to achieve moratorium status. So I think there would be an incentive on the town side to create this financial incentive for a deed restriction if we can get that 10-year thing to link up so that they could qualify for a moratorium. I wouldn't get, although I see it referenced 2% number and all that, it looks bad on a comparison level, but you need to take a deeper dive into that. But what we can and will be qualifying for is moratorium credit points that achieve an initial 4-year moratorium, potentially even a subsequent 5-year moratorium. So I think we should be more focused on that goal than looking at that 10% number, which we've never.
But the moratorium requires a change in the law. The change does not require.
It would. Well, either change, either would be in the law, or the Department of Housing has to change the interpretation of the council.
I agree with all those, but I just make 2 more, which is the denominator set every year is set based on the last decennial census. So
Every
it's
10 years.
good for 10 years until the next census rolls around and it's reset. Numerator would change as we add units, but the other point I want to make if you look, you do that deeper dive into the composition of our affordable housing inventory, you look at from year to year where the changes occur. It's typically in those traffic-backed mortgages and tenant-based rental assistance. The government-assisted units, deed-restricted units typically are pretty static. I mean, there are examples where deed-restricted units come off restriction and more, but they don't move a lot. But traffic-backed mortgages changes a lot from year to year. And that can impact you at 2.57, you're saying now 2.54. That's more likely the explanation for it, as opposed to some other change with regard to restricted units. So that's an important point that I wanted to reference. No one had.
I just wanted to make a comment about ADUs as well. I mean, for the ADUs that we have, this is primarily a way for people to house members of their family. So, you know, as we talk about kind of multi-pronged affordable housing approaches, this is one approach, but it's not going to solve everything, even if we're able to kind of negotiate getting that count towards one or the other of our buckets that we have to meet. Because, you know, that would assume that these folks who are really trying to house members of their family as their first goal, that they then want to move into renting these. And what we have found as we monitored these over the years is a lot of these sit empty because these folks don't want to be landlords. So they create them to meet a specific family need, which is important because, you know, it meets an affordability where either an older portion of their family or a younger portion of their family or a sibling or a cousin or whoever, they want to be able to house them in a way that's affordable to both parties within this extended family. But these aren't folks who their first thought is, oh, I want to rent this. So I think we have to just kind of be careful about what an ADU is and what it can do for us.
So, I guess my understanding is now in the 2021 legislative change, ADUs will become affordable denominator.
Right.
That was clarified, correct.
Numerator, right?
On page 31, you have accessory apartment, separate dwelling.
Not presently in our regulations.
Sorry.
The page,
Can a mobile be accessory?
Only if it's fixed to a foundation. If it's designed to be moved, it can't. I mean, right now, we only permit a detached ADU, as you know, in the 2-acre zone. And it can't be a vehicle that's designed to be moved. A manufactured home that's on a foundation, yes. We haven't seen any proposed. I think since we've adopted that provision, I think maybe we've had 4 or 5 folks that have done detached, but largely existing structures, old, farm, carriage house.
Didn't I read manufactured home in your somewhere? I can't talk. I'm sure.
Maybe the glossary terms, I don't know.
Yeah, in the glossary.
Okay.
But I'm saying. So whatever regulations you're saying now.
Your question is, can it be a, well, what do you mean by a trailer? That's what-
Or Westport, Parker.
It can, if it's on a foundation, yes,
Then yes, it could.
it could.
Steve.
Just out of curiosity, are RVs or, campers allowed dwelling units of our reg?
You're not allowed to use you can store an RV on your property and we treat that as an accessory structure. It has to be set back like an accessory structure, but you're not permitted to use it as a dwelling unit. So while it's on your property, people living in it. Same with a boat. You can't live on a boat.
While it's
Take off the
in
wheels,
dryness.
put onto a foundation.
So theoretically, yes, on the, what's now considered, manufactured home, we haven't seen anybody avail themselves of that. But just like today, we can't prohibit someone from putting a manufactured home on a single, and use it as a single family residence as their primary dwelling either. But we haven't seen, the cost. I think that's the fact of the value of a lot. If you're paying 300,000, 400,000 plus for a parcel of land to build a house on, it's likely not going to be your first choice.
I have a question about the process of the affordable housing plan. So this has to be approved by June. This is our last joint meeting. Do you need to hear from us on what we prefer on some of these metrics that you're putting there? Like, for instance, I'm thinking of the set asides. Is there, I think I saw 15% on there. Is that what you're angling towards, or could we go higher?
I think we were originally saying between 15 and 20%, potentially depending on what zoning district we might be within. But that, I don't know if we have to be that precise. Really capturing the concept.
This is more of a conceptual.
Let me answer that this way. I think in Steve and Glenn and the rest of your committee, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the committee is asking for feedback on is whether or not you support the general recommendations that putting forth in this plan. We need not today decide what that percentage ought to be, but is there an appetite for us to consider modifying that regulation down to a number higher than it is present? And similarly, is there an appetite to consider maybe, is it okay to include in their recommendations, their plan, for us to consider tweaking our design residence district regulation to perhaps allowing a menu of opportunity? So again, we need not decide on what those requirements are tonight. Those are the subject to future hearings and discussions, or whether or not you generally support the recommendations.
And to
Correct. All whatever may be in here, but all of it. Not to decide today what that number ought to be, but do you really have opposition to even including it in the plan, or is it okay to consider putting it in the plan for future implementation consideration?
Are there metrics that we have to meet with this plan, with the state? Like, if we don't follow or adhere to this, what happens?
Well, we have to produce an updated plan every 5 years. It has to meet certain criteria that Glenn went through in terms of, how are we going to increase it. It's, again, I don't recall the exact language, but we do have to provide a plan. Some are, I know the Housing Working Group is looking at some of the plans already that have been filed. But I don't know if you had anything more.
I think
on that.
in Public Act,
Yeah.
yeah. So as part of Public Act 2129, which was mentioned as being the recent significant legislation in the last session, I think it was section 13 of the act created a committee on Connecticut's development and future. One of the things that's in their charge is to evaluate the plans, and I forget exactly what the language is, but it sort of hinted to me that there may be additional standards that might come in the future. So if people, every town that I have been working with is taking this very seriously and looking at how we can address this issue. So I'm not aware of any town that's taking it frivolously, but if they were to determine that some communities were, they might provide standards in the future. So I think we should all sort of anticipate the fact that the legislature is probably going to evaluate this over time, and there's no penalty if we miss the June 1 deadline.
I think our goal is, the 2014 plan articulated that, which was taking control of our future, really coming up with what we consider to be strategies that might work from Fairfield, as opposed to having some solution imposed from without. So I think that's true here too. If we don't take the lead in figuring out what does work within our community like ours, there's the risk that others will help define that for us, and we prefer to kind of take the lead ourselves and figure out what does or doesn't work and put that forward. So that's kind of what we've always used as our guiding principle, which is let's come up with strategies that work for Fairfield, and let's try that best to implement those with your help. Was there anything, I'll turn it around differently than Jim posed the question, but was there anything in the strategies that we outlined tonight that gave you pause that we shouldn't consider? I mean,
Back to the slides.
was that?
You go back to those slides just to.
You're staying right there. Do I have to share screen?
Doing something.
He's got, if you take a look at Steve's one page handout.
Oh, there they are.
Yeah.
Okay.
As soon as, I'm just messing with you.
You are. So you got them all on the document that Steve had.
I think these were the ones that we've identified as probably having the most impact. Kathy?
What I'm most curious about is the trust fund.
Yeah.
We don't have that much money in there, like.
Well, I will tell you that the last 3-year average has been about $460,000 a year. We're collecting into that fund.
How can we increase that so we can do something more with it? Like spend $3 million? Can we legally increase fees? I mean, how can we?
Well, the
Other sources of money.
right now, the regulation says it's a $5 per $1,000 value assessment. That's on top of the other fees that they pay. If somebody's building a $5 million project, they're going to pay $5 per $1,000 to the trust fund, but they're also paying $5 per $1,000 plus to a building permit cost, and then a similar number to the fire marshal for their permitting process. So it's fairly expensive.
And that's the only source of our money for the trust fund, or we can,
Yeah, there's a small amount.
Other than direct donation.
or grant money from,
We have a small amount of donations, we have a small amount of rental income. As you recall, we purchased some of the properties within the Navy housing, the Parkview Commons development. We had some holdover tenants, and they're paying rent to continue to live there until they secure other housing, and that money goes into the housing trust. One of the things that housing committee has looked at is, are there opportunities for us to diversify, those sources of income for the housing trust fund, whether it's, working with secure donations, foundations, or other programs that we might then have that could increase the amount of money that we have at our disposal. The other idea was to use the housing trust fund to leverage other sources of funding. So, when we looked at part of the comments, we did secure the approval of the Board of Finance and RTM to allocate bond anticipation, but to borrow money using the housing trust fund as a repayment mechanism. We haven't had that, but that does give us the ability to perhaps go beyond what we actually have in the bank right now to go buy additional property.
should that be part of your guidelines, or is that part of the guidelines for the housing trust fund?
It's kind of our secondary. So we were kind of focused tonight, definitely wanted to make sure that we got talk through some of the issues that have a land use implication, because the last thing, not that this is the be-all end-all, we want to have further conversation. We don't want to include something in our plan that is a definite,
Yeah.
not what we consider.
Thank you.
One of the things that it was brought to our attention, I think at one point, a couple of years ago, by an employee in town who has a property on the Cape, and Wellfleet actually does a utility stuffer once a year to solicit contributions to their housing trust fund. I will just plant that idea with the Affordable Housing Committee and leave it like that.
Wellfleet, how many?
An order of magnitude, in general, someone's building, the builder's coming in and building a house.
Yeah.
They're generally paying at least $2,500 to $3,500 in an affordable housing. So it's adding to the cost of that unit. So that's kind of the order of magnitude on a new single family house. It's about $2,500 to $3,000 fee per house. The largest by far, the universities, since we've adopted this, have done some major projects. So their both arenas, for example, have paid affordable housing fees of collectively about $500,000 for both of those big projects. So we weren't getting direct, we get pilot, but the universities have been by and large the largest payor into that fund. Some of the dormitory projects, clearly Sacred Heart dormitory projects, your arenas, Fairfield Views arenas, some of the new townhouses. So of that 1.5 million, I think to date, we've collected, I'd say probably 2/3, at least half, it's been paid by both of the universities. But just for the general applicant, you know, a single family house is 25, like I said, $2,500 to $3,500. You bring an addition to your house, again, you're gonna pay $5 for $1,000 in value on top of what's going to cost you to do that. So I just want to give you a little magnitude of that the cost per permit. But again, to go, what's that?
Mark, is there anybody in the public, you know, that on Zoom that has something that they want to add? And while Mark is doing that, so we want your comments, you know, we've got 7 strategies and 4 supporting actions. Your comments be appreciated, but don't limit yourself just to that. If you have ideas that we've not incorporated, please send them through.
We have, I don't see anything in the chat. Win, Herb, or Kelly, do you have any questions you'd like to pose? Either directly or the chat? If so, you want to mute yourself at this point. Anything else before we finish up?
Thank you very much for your hard work.
Steve, any closing remarks? Comments?
Just thank you. Yeah.
Tommy, I had to run out. Lenny, would you like to say anything for planning and zoning?
I think this is great collaboration. It continues, you passed the 3:30 internal deadline for the finalization plan and up through the adoption of the plan. But you know, certainly beyond that, I think we should continue to interface because even just in a couple of hours, we were able, you know, by putting a collective entity to come up with even some new ideas.
We're just finishing up. I don't know if you had anything else you'd like to add.
All set, thank you.
All right. Well, I appreciate everyone coming. If nothing further, we'll adjourn the meeting at 8:35. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.